We honor the Queen of Heaven.
What if I told you the God of the Bible had a wife? Not a metaphor, not a symbol, a real goddess, worshipped alongside Yahweh in the Temple of Jerusalem itself. For centuries, the Bible has told us a story of pure monotheism. One God, no others. But archaeology tells a different story. In the 1970s, at a remote site in the Sinai Peninsula called Kuntillet Ajrud, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary. Scratched onto a large storage jar was an inscription in ancient Hebrew. It read, "I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and by his Asherah." Wait, his Asherah? Asherah was one of the most important goddesses in the ancient Near East, the consort of the high god El, the mother of the gods, linked with fertility, motherhood, and sacred trees. But here she was, paired with Yahweh, the God of Israel. Another inscription from Khirbet el-Qom, found near Hebron, reads, "Blessed be Uriah by Yahweh and by his Asherah. From his enemies he saved him." Same formula, hundreds of miles apart. And this wasn't written by pagans. It was written by Israelites. This wasn't a fringe cult. This was mainstream religion. As scholar Francesca Stavrakopoulou notes, these inscriptions suggest that most Yahweh worshippers did not share the biblical writer's derogatory view of Asherah. So here's the question that haunts this story. If Asherah was so deeply embedded in Israelite religion, probably from the start, what happened to her? And why was she erased so completely? The answer will change how you read the Bible forever. To understand Asherah, we need to go back to a time long before the Bible was written. In ancient Canaan, the supreme god was El, the patriarch of the gods, the father of the divine assembly. And El had a consort. Her name was Athirat, the Ugaritic form of Asherah. She was called the creatress of the gods and the mother of the 70 divine sons. She was the queen of the high god, the wet nurse of the gods, the lady of the sea. But she wasn't just a mother goddess. She was a political power, a kingmaker. In the Baal cycle, a mythological drama discovered at Ugaritic, dating to roughly the 13th century BCE, Asherah appears as the figure who legitimizes kingship. When Baal wants to build his royal palace, he needs permission from El. He tries to persuade El, but he fails. So he turns to Athirat. She rides to El and successfully petitions him to approve Baal's palace. She says, "Our king is mightiest Baal, our ruler with none above him." And El is persuaded. The palace gets built. Baal becomes king, and Asherah is the one who made it happen. She was functionally the one who decided who sat on the divine throne. And just as the storm god Baal has a long history under different names, the goddess we meet as Athirat at Ugaritic also has deep roots in ancient Near Eastern history. About 600 or 700 years before the Baal cycle, we find a goddess in Babylonian sources named Ashratum, the consort of the god Amuru. In these sources, she's called the bride of the king of heaven and mistress of sexual vigor and rejoicing. A form of her was also worshipped by the Hittites in Anatolia. So Asherah was not born as a Canaanite goddess. By the time she appears in the Baal cycle around the 1200s BCE, she was already worshipped for centuries across the Near East and Mesopotamia, from Babylon to the Syrian steppe to the coast of Lebanon, but also in the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. The Hebrew Bible mentions Asherah 40 times, though the meaning is often ambiguous. In some passages, Asherah is clearly a goddess. In 1 Kings 18, we hear about 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Queen Jezebel's table, a passage that only makes sense if Asherah is a deity with her own priesthood. But in other passages, the word Asherah seems to refer to a cultic object, a wooden pole or sacred tree set up at places of worship. Deuteronomy 16 says, "You shall not plant any tree as an Asherah, nor shall you set up a stone pillar, things that the Lord your God hates." So from the very start, we're dealing with a word that can mean a goddess or an object, and scholars have debated for years how to untangle these two meanings. What's clear, however, is that the biblical writers were deeply hostile to Asherah worship. The Deuteronomistic history, the editorial framework that shapes the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, judges every king of Israel and Judah on a single criterion. Did he tolerate the Asherahs or destroy them? This hostility reached its climax under King Josiah. According to 2 Kings, Josiah came to power around 640 BCE. And in the 18th year of his reign, his priests discovered a book of the law in the temple, likely an early version of Deuteronomy. When Josiah heard what was in this book, he tore his clothing in anguish. Almost everything happening in Israelite religion was wrong. What followed was a massive, sweeping religious reform, a kingdom-wide demolition project. 2 Kings 23 describes Josiah commanding the high priest to bring out all the vessels made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the host of heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem. 2 verses later, he brought out the Asherah from the house of the Lord outside Jerusalem, burned it, beat it to dust, and threw the dust of it upon the graves of the common people. 1 verse later, he broke down the houses of the male cult prostitutes that were in the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the Asherah. Apparently, organized worship of Asherah was being conducted through guilds of women operating within the temple itself, presumably for generations. But here's the paradox. The hostility of the biblical writers is itself a clue. You don't repeatedly forbid what nobody is doing. Asherah, or at least Asherah objects, were a persistent, deeply embedded presence in Israelite religion. So why were they so determined to destroy her? The most direct evidence comes from archaeology. At Kuntillet Ajrud, a hilltop site in the northeastern Sinai, archaeologists discovered multiple inscriptions pairing the God of Israel with Asherah. One inscription on the wall of a shrine reads, "To Yahweh of Teman and to his Asherah." Another on a storage jar reads, "I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and by his Asherah." Now scholars have debated whether this is the goddess herself or the cult object. Some argue the grammar can be read without a possessive sense, just by Yahweh and by Asherah. Others argue the possessive his suggests something more personal. But one thing is clear. The inscription pairs Yahweh and Asherah in blessing. And these aren't isolated examples. Another inscription from Khirbet el-Qom, found near Hebron, dating to around 750 BCE, reads, "Blessed be Uriah by Yahweh and by his Asherah. From his enemies he saved him." Same formula, hundreds of miles apart. And then there are the figures on the storage jars. The drawings show 2 figures positioned like a husband and wife, a male figure and a female figure. Some scholars argue this depicts Yahweh and Asherah. On the reverse side of the same pot, there's a stylized tree flanked by 2 ibexes, a symbol associated with Asherah. And then there are the Judean pillar figurines. Found by the hundreds in Judahite homes, these small clay female figurines with prominent breasts date to the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the same period as the Kuntillet Ajrud inscriptions. Some scholars like William Dever identify these with Asherah. The pillar-shaped body evokes a tree trunk, the Asherah pole in miniature form. Other scholars, like Aaron Darby, argue the figurines may have functioned as protective magical objects and might not represent any specific goddess at all. But even the skeptics agree on one thing. The figurines were deeply embedded in household religious practice. They were part of what ordinary Israelites actually did, not just what the biblical writers prescribed. As one scholar put it, this was the religion of most ancient Israelites most of the time. So what happened? The erasure of Asherah happened in 2 stages. The first was physical. Josiah's reforms in the late 600s BCE were a massive top-down attempt to purge her from Israelite worship. The Asherah poles were burned. The image was dragged out of the temple. According to 2 Kings, that was the moment Asherah was officially suppressed. But the erasure actually deepened over the centuries in translations. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek around the 3rd century BCE, the translation known as the Septuagint, the translators encountered the word Asherah, and they translated it as alsos, meaning grove or sacred tree. The Latin translation inherited that tradition with the word lucus, also meaning grove. And when the King James Bible was produced in 1611, English readers opened their Bibles and read about Josiah cutting down the grove in the house of the Lord. They read about Gideon cutting down his father's grove. They read about the 400 prophets of the groves which ate at Jezebel's table. The goddess had been reduced to a tree, a wooden object, a footnote. It wasn't until the late 1800s and early 1900s, when scholars began rediscovering the goddess in Akkadian and Ugaritic texts, that translators started restoring her name to English Bibles. And even today, the debate continues. Was Asherah the wife of God, or just a cultic object, or something in between? But here's the truth. The archaeological evidence strongly suggests that for many ancient Israelites, for many centuries, the God of Israel had a consort. Her name was Asherah. She wasn't a foreign import smuggled in by figures like Queen Jezebel. She was part of mainstream Israelite religion, emerging from the same Canaanite cultural context from which Israelite society emerged. As scholar William Dever puts it, this was the religion of most ancient Israelites most of the time. So what happened to Asherah after she was erased? Some scholars argue her legacy survived in unexpected places. The menorah, the seven-branched lampstand that became a symbol of Judaism, may have originated as a stylized sacred tree, echoing the iconography of Asherah. The figure of Lady Wisdom in Proverbs, a female divine figure who stands beside God, may have drawn on Asherah traditions. And some scholars even see echoes of Asherah in Christian art, where Mary is depicted with tree-like imagery. But perhaps the most surprising survival is in Jewish mysticism itself. The Sefer Zohar, the most important expression of the Kabbalah, has an absolutely startling passage wherein it argues that the prohibition on worshipping Asherah was only to prevent a kind of one-sided appreciation of the divine. Rather, Asherah is simply the female aspect of the divine, the Shekinah. And thus to worship the divine in its fullness, both the masculine and the feminine must be joined together into a divine totality. Asherah, once belittled, mocked, and erased from Israelite history, is returning from her theological exile at the very heart of Jewish mysticism. But here's the deeper lesson. The story of Asherah is not just about a forgotten goddess, it's about how power uses stories to control. The biblical writers didn't just oppose Asherah worship, they rewrote history to make it seem like Israel had always been monotheistic. They erased a goddess. They burned her symbols, they buried her memory, and for thousands of years we didn't even know she existed. But archaeology brought her back. And her story raises a question that scholars still debate. What other truths have been erased from history? What other gods, goddesses, and traditions have been buried beneath the weight of religious orthodoxy? So who was Asherah? A goddess? A symbol? A tree? The ancient Israelites worshipped her alongside Yahweh for centuries, and the biblical writers spent just as much time trying to erase her, but she survived. In the inscriptions, in the figurines, in the sacred trees that still appear in our religious art, and in the questions we're still asking, was the God of Israel married to a goddess? Scholars don't agree. Did ancient Israelites believe that? The archaeological evidence says yes, at least for some of them. And why does it matter? Because it shows us that religion is never static. It evolves, it changes, and sometimes it erases what it no longer wants to remember. If this story changed the way you think about the Bible, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, was Asherah the wife of God or just a forgotten symbol? I'll see you in the next one.